And welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about QAnon. Our guest for this conversation is Mike Rothschild. Mike Rothschild has been covering QAnon since it began back in 2018, and he is the author of a book that is now out in paperback called The Storm is Upon Us: How QAnon Became a Movement, Cult, and Conspiracy Theory of Everything. Mike Rothschild, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this radio program.
That's great to be here.
Is QAnon still a thing?
Well, yes, QAnon is still very much a thing, but because this is all much more complicated than it needs to be, it's a thing in a very different kind of way. So the QAnon that we really came to understand from it, when it began in October 2017 until Joe Biden's inauguration, really is not the going concern anymore. That was the hashtags and the Q drops and the Twitter threads decoding what things really meant, and people showing up at Trump rallies with their Q t-shirts and signs. And some days it would bring 24 new Q drops, and the disinformation reporters were furiously trying to figure out what they all meant and watching them spread. That's not really happening anymore. But what you have had instead is a mainstreaming of the mythology of QAnon. So the branding and the iconography is really not there as much anymore, but the ideas of QAnon are now kind of everywhere. And, they've penetrated into places that the Q branding really never did. You never saw mainstream Republicans affirming QAnon or talking really positively about it. But they will now talk openly about COVID is a hoax, the election was stolen, Biden's a fake president, cancel culture is the biggest threat that we could ever possibly have. All of those are things that Q talked about a lot, but without the hashtags and the catchphrases and some of the really lurid stuff, the sex trafficking and the occult rituals, which is stuff most people are not interested in anyway. It's much more diffuse and much more mainstream.
That's what I wanted to ask about. Did some things pass through sort of the mainstreaming of QAnon and some didn't? Did it make it more quote unquote acceptable?
Yeah, it's become a lot more acceptable by dropping some of the really esoteric stuff. So you are not going to see most people referring to the Q drops anymore. So you don't have things like the deltas. It's something I talk about in the book, this idea of Q believers sort of talking themselves into Q being real because Trump would post something 3 seconds after a Q drop, and that proves that they're related. And 3 years later, that Q drop came true based on a typo in the Trump. That kind of like digital entrail reading is just too weird for most people. But the basic ideas of QAnon are actually very durable, and they're something that have been a part of conspiracy culture for a long time, and they will continue to be a part of conspiracy culture really as long as we have that.
Has it morphed into sort of out of this movement known as QAnon, and you'll correct anything I say,
Sure.
but more into sort of conspiracy around election integrity?
It is very much around election integrity. It's not even so much election integrity because they don't really understand how those things work and they don't care. What they believe is that Trump won the election and won a landslide. And everything that's happened has been the deep state denying Trump that victory. And we just get closer and closer to the victory actually finally being unveiled. So that's why you have all the audits and all the lawsuits and all of the, the cyber symposium and all of the different movies and the books and the podcasts. All of it points toward Trump triumphantly returning to office. Never mind that it would have been much easier to just win the election, the way he did in 2016. But of course, that is not what happened. So you have to take what actually happened and fold it into the narrative that you're constructing, rather than say, well, we had 4 years, it was great, now we got to move on and do something else. That's not how these people work.
I saw a story yesterday in the Washington Post talking about how states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Colorado are having officials that are actually, according to the Post, illegally asking access to the machines from still the 2020 election. Is this a part of that story?
This is a big part of that story. The aftermath of the election really saw the infrastructure of voting become the villain here, and specifically Dominion voting systems. So you've seen a year and a half of conspiracy theories about Dominion, about one of the other companies, Smartmatic, some of the technology that was supposedly around vote security, things like Hammer and Scorecard, these CIA programs. Who knows if this stuff even exists? It doesn't matter if it exists. What you have in something like Dominion is a company that is very easy to pin down as the object of blame for the election being stolen. Now, never mind, again, that Dominion does not administer elections in every state. And many of the counties where Dominion administered the elections were easily won by Trump. That stuff is just swept aside. Everything is rolled into the narrative, into the grand conspiracy, and you're able to pull more things in. And that's really how QAnon works, is that it pulls in elements of all of these different things. So you get COVID conspiracies, you get current events and news, you get pop culture. It all gets fused together. And there probably are not very many conspiracy believers who believe every single aspect of all of this. But you don't have to. It doesn't work that way. It's much more of a buffet where you pick a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and you create your own conspiracy world, and maybe only you live in it, or maybe a few other people live in it. And so it's very adaptable, it's very malleable, and that's what makes it so durable. It is able to survive crushing disconfirmation, Trump losing, the Republicans in retreat. It's able to survive the Q branding becoming toxic. It's able to move on because it encompasses things that very many people believe are real. It just does it in a way that is much more mainstream and much more palatable.
How does this jump to the mainstream happen?
Sure. The jump of QAnon really started very quickly, and it very quickly broke out from 4chan, which is a place most people don't want anything to do with, as they should. Nobody should really do anything on 4chan.
It's a website.
Right. It's an image board, and there are parts of 4chan that are fine, but there are a lot of parts of it that are really awful. And Q started in one of those really awful places. But it jumped to Reddit and Twitter and YouTube because it was telling a story that people wanted to be true. And when you have a story that people want to be true, in this case, Hillary Clinton being brought to justice for her many crimes, whatever those were, you can jump some of the barriers that prevent some of these things from going mainstream. So in December, when two of the big Q evangelists went on InfoWars and started talking about how we need people to join our cause, this is the greatest military intelligence operation of all time, they found a group of people who would never go to 4chan, but listen to InfoWars all the time. And they would take that belief to Reddit, to Twitter, to Facebook. And so it's very easy for these things to jump to the mainstream when they're presented in a way that lets you be part of it. And the stolen election industry is very much the same thing. There are people who just create conspiracy personas out of the election, who have willed themselves into being experts on some of this technology, who breathlessly share these videos and these podcasts and these blogs. So it goes mainstream because enough people want it to be true, and it's presented in a way that is very easy to share.
Is InfoWars and Alex Jones a part of QAnon, or was a part of QAnon?
Alex Jones was definitely on the Q train at the beginning. I think he saw it as a growing movement of people who were plugged into stuff that he would talk about, and the interface there was very easy. One of the people who did a lot of reporting for Alex Jones was this guy Jerome Corsi, who has written about the fake Obama birth certificate supposedly and all of this other stuff. And he kind of designated himself the InfoWars 8chan reporter. But then it kind of fell apart for Alex Jones when he realized that Q was becoming a lot more popular with different audiences than he was. And then he turned on it because the Q community really saw Alex Jones as an infiltrator. He was a grifter. He was a false flag. He was secretly an Israeli intelligence agent, whatever it is. So Alex turned against Q, and he's done actually a lot of ranting about how horrible Q is and how it's all a joke and it's all fake and a psyop. So at this point, the Q and Alex Jones really don't trust each other, but there is still an enormous amount of overlap there. So there's always a lot of kind of feuding and who is mad at who and who's called who a scammer today, but it's all kind of fake. And everything, these people all believe the same thing. They're just all desperate to be the one who makes the most money off it.
That's interesting, but maybe not surprising.
No, it's not
You'd have
surprising.
rivaling sort of factions within conspiracy movements of who is truly, bringing, I guess, the message or so.
Right.
Yeah. I guess even Jacob Chansley, this was the QAnon shaman that we recognize wearing the horns at the Capitol, went on to his program and they had a falling out.
Yeah. I don't know all the details of that, but I know there's a lot of Q people who think that Chansley is a Fed, he's a plant, he's here to make us look bad, no real Q believer would ever be violent. I mean, come on, that's clearly ridiculous. But there is a very cult-like mentality with groups like this where the in-group is very insular and we all take care of each other, but the out-group is scary and they hate us and they want to destroy us. And it's very easy for the in-group to push somebody out and have them be part of the bad people. And I think they've done that with Alex Jones. They've done that with Chansley. A lot of the other January 6th Q people, oh, they're not one of us. We would never do that. Q people don't talk like that. It is a constant covering up of your own misdeeds and projecting them onto others.
So understanding that the ideas of QAnon, some of them, such as election integrity, have sort of hopped over into the mainstream. Has this infighting hurt QAnon itself and the movement?
I don't think the infighting has really hurt the Q movement. It's hard to tell kind of who takes it seriously and who's in it for a laugh or for the money. So you've had things like Mike Flynn and Lynn Wood sniping at each other on Telegram. Lynn Wood's sniping at Sidney Powell. Sidney Powell's sniping at Patrick Byrne. I mean, all of these people are just kind of constantly kind of poking each other, but they're all on the same team. They're all believers. They're all making money off it. They're all making their branding off of it. It's just kind of, do you believe my version of it or do you believe their version of it? But it doesn't hurt because they all believe the same thing. There's not a Q promoter who thinks Biden won the election legitimately. It's just different shades.
I do want to get into, in a moment, money made off of all of this, but maybe we should take a step back. I think everyone recognizes the term QAnon, thinks of conspiracy theories, but may not necessarily know what QAnon is precisely. In fact, I'm not sure I know what QAnon. I'm not sure if you even know, but I'm sure you do know. So I said in my intro that QAnon began in 2018, but I think I heard you say something about 2017.
Yeah, it started in late October of 2017, and it started off as a series of anonymous posts on 4chan in a very Trump-friendly, very meme-heavy part of 4chan, where there's a tradition of people showing up as anons. So these are people who pretended to be anonymous insiders with the FBI, with the White House, with British intelligence. All kinds of people would pretend to be dishing out answers to secret questions. And so they would say portentous things that are sort of done very cryptically, and then they would just disappear. And 4chan has had a lot of these characters come and go. And so what became known as QAnon at the beginning was very much the same, very similar to these kinds of anonymous figures. The first couple of Q posts really didn't go anywhere. They were about Hillary Clinton being arrested. Her passport had been flagged. She was about to be extradited. The Marines and National Guard would be called up to quell the riots that would go on. And this was all based on a conspiracy theory that was already going on at the time, which was that there was going to be an Antifa uprising in early November of 2017, that the combined anti-Trump forces were going to go door to door demanding people swear their loyalty to the deep state, or there were going to be riots, and all of this was going to happen while the Q operation was going on. But this started to take off because it told a story that was actually very well told. There was there's a very Tom Clancy techno thriller aspect to the early Q drops. So these anonymous posts were coming out. At some point early on, the poster behind them declared themselves to be Q Clearance Patriot. and that was their Anon name. Now, Q clearance is a real thing. It's a Department of Energy designation. It's actually very common. I know people who have Q clearance. It's not that big of a deal.
And what does that mean, Q clearance?
Q clearance is the term for people who are read in on certain secrets regarding nuclear energy. So, people who work in the space program have Q clearance. People who work at JPL have Q clearance. It has nothing to do with like top level Defense Department stuff, but there is a strain of belief that says that there is. So the term Q clearance had been thrown around in an episode of the show Archer. The sort of secret agent cartoon. It had been used in the book Behold a Pale Horse to designate sort of top secret clearance, the classic conspiracy theory book that's hugely popular to this day. So that term was very much in the sort of the conspiracy theory world. But the Q clearance Patriot was specifically applying it to the arrest of Hillary Clinton and her cronies. And this stuff took off. This was a story people really wanted to be true. It very quickly found evangelists who took it to Reddit, who started making YouTube videos that were getting tens of thousands of views, started making Twitter threads about it. And it very quickly became something that you didn't have to be plugged into anti-Semitic, pro-Trump 4chan culture to understand, because most people aren't. Most people don't want anything to do with that. But if you're watching a video and you're like, oh, there's a secret military intelligence operation going on, and it's finally going to take down Hillary Clinton, and then you find these Q drops that are not on 4chan, they're posted on these other websites that are they're putting out the drops, that are decoding them, that are telling you what they mean. You don't have to go to a place like 4chan. Suddenly anybody can be part of this. And now suddenly you have a movement. And this really happened within a couple of months in 2017, and it really took off from there.
Okay, so that's where the Q comes from then, is this designation of access to secret information. And for them, yes. QAnon was somebody from actually within the Department of Defense.
Yes, QAnon was said to be a military intelligence team of between 3 and 10 people who worked close together with President Trump. There are hints in QAnon that Q is flying on Air Force One, is getting autographed gifts from Trump, is working so closely that Trump will handwrite notes to Q. They'll post together. Never mind that Trump has no idea how the internet works. Is famously tech illiterate, doesn't even have an email address. It doesn't matter. All of that is, that's planted in the media to make you underestimate Trump. Trump's a, chess master who's, thousands of moves ahead of his enemies, and everything is unfolding as portrayed, and, the plan is working. It's all done to keep people on the hook for the next element of the story. And of course, the story has no ending. There's no, the story doesn't go anywhere. The clues and the cryptic nonsense, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have a solution. The solution is whatever you want it to be. So you end up having kind of infinite different versions of this conspiracy based on the personal beliefs of the person who believes it.
Tell me about these early drops, and what were they that were causing them to spread? What caused its popularity?
There's a real specificity to some of these early drops. There are very specific things that are supposed to happen. There are ways that you will know things are going on. Hillary Clinton is going to be arrested at this exact time on this exact day. When it happens, Trump will say this exact thing. He was supposed to go on Twitter and tweet, "My fellow Americans, the storm is upon us," with 7 periods after it. Never 6, never 8, only 7. That is the way you will know that it is happening. It is a specificity that allows people to feel like they know what's about to happen. Now, the problem with that is when it doesn't happen, you don't have anywhere to go. There's no wiggle room in Trump will tweet this and you will know that the arrests are coming on this day, because Trump is not going to tweet that and the arrests are not going to come. So what happened after those early dates fizzled out is that Q started to sort of reposition what all of this meant. It's a term that you find sometimes in like comic books and TV called retcon. It stands for retroactive continuity. So all of the things that Q said, they didn't mean what Q said. They actually mean something else, but that something else is going to be revealed as the story goes on. So Hillary Clinton actually meant Saudi Arabia. Now, never mind that you would have no way of knowing that. That makes no sense whatsoever. And it completely contradicts everything that Q said up until then. It doesn't matter, because now you've got people hooked into a story, and they so desperately want it to be true that they will follow any twists and turns that take them wherever the Q poster wants them to go.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with journalist Mike Rothschild about his book, The Storm is Upon Us, How QAnon Became a Movement, Cult, and Conspiracy Theory of Everything. My understanding is we actually got some more QAnon drops within the last month or within the last few weeks. But
yeah.
But before that, we hadn't had anything really since the election.
Right. So Q posted an enormous amount of nonsense in 2020. And all of it really led up to where we are now, with the idea that there was no way Trump could lose the election. Joe Biden was a decrepit husk being hidden away in his basement, and that he maybe wasn't even going to make it to the election. He was going to get changed out at the last minute for Michelle Obama. I mean, all of these conspiracy theories. But they were things that really caught on with the stolen election industry, because what it meant was that Trump didn't introduce the idea that the election was stolen. That was going on in, certainly his communications, but also with Q. So once the election was over and it was clear that Biden was going to be inaugurated, Q really had to change. You can't have a conspiracy theory that revolves around the president of the United States tweeting out a signal for mass arrests when the president is not Trump anymore.
Yeah.
And presumably Joe Biden would not signal the mass arrest of his own deep state. So Q really had to change form. And for that to happen, you really couldn't have drops anymore. The Q drops couldn't mean what they meant before. So the Q drops stopped. There were a couple done right after the election, but then they stopped completely in December of 2020. And there was nothing until June of 2022, when Q just appeared again, except there were clues in what happened around that made it absolutely clear that it was the owner of 8chan, which is now called 8kun. 8chan was deplatformed. It came back as 8kun. It's a long story and it doesn't really matter. But the Q drops came back in a way that made it clear that it was Jim Watkins, who owns 8kun, who was doing this. There were certain identifiers in the Q posts, and all of those things changed when Q made the new posts, and then they went back to the way they were. Nobody could do that except Jim Watkins. So it was clearly him doing this. And once it was figured out very easily, there was no real point to doing it. And of course, Jim Watkins is going, "Oh, I didn't do it. It wasn't me. I don't know who runs Q." It's so unconvincing that there's really no point to even denying it. And there hasn't been another new Q drop since those. I think there were only 4, but there's really no need for them. Nobody needs them. Nobody really wants them. It's kind of like the Bible, where people don't go to church because they're hoping that there's going to be a new book of the Bible. Nobody thinks that the Bible is going to be added to. You just you go off of what's already there, and you endlessly reinterpret it for whatever is going on in your life, whatever is going on in the world. Q is very much the same. There is really no need for there ever to be a new Q drop.
So again, Jim Watkins, who
Sure.
The website went from 4chan, which we were talking about earlier, to 8chan, and then to 8kun, which
Yes.
it's called now. Because he owns and runs and operates 8kun, there's no other way that Q could be anyone else, because this is where Q posts the drops.
Right. So fairly early on, there was a kind of rule handed down by Q that Q would never post drops anywhere else. It's actually rather clever to do that. What that does is it eliminates any ideas of imposters. So there's not going to be a Twitter Q. There's not going to be a Telegram Q. Q only posts on 8kun. So if it's not on 8kun, it's not Q. So there is a Q figure going around on Truth Social, Trump's very useless social media site. but nobody really believes that it's Q because Q doesn't post it. Q only posts on 8kun. So what that does is it keeps the Q poster rooted to that particular board. And the only reason you would do that is if you are involved in it. So it's the circumstantial evidence, or one of the pieces of circumstantial evidence, that to me proves that Jim Watkins is maybe not making the Q posts. It might have been his son Ron, it might have been somebody who worked for him, but Jim Watkins clearly controlled what went on the board and could have stopped it at any point, could have banned Q, could have exposed it. And of course, he's not going to do that because he wants people going to his site. And nobody really goes to 8kun anymore. It really experienced its biggest surge in popularity when there were new Q drops. Without Q drops, there's no reason to go there. It's a very buggy, very almost impossible to use site. It offers nothing. So Jim has a vested interest in people coming back to 8kun, which is why, it made sense for him to be doing these couple of new drops and for him and his son to be running Q in the first place. There's really nobody else who benefits from it except them.
If it was determined, again, you're saying there's no one else who could be posting these other than Jim Watkins. It doesn't mean he's necessarily writing them.
Right.
If we were to definitively say Jim Watkins is Q, would that put him in any kind of legal jeopardy?
No, it really wouldn't. Neither Ron or Jim really face any kind of legal repercussions from Q because they are protected speech in the United States. There is no law against posting cryptic nonsense on an image board, and there shouldn't be. There should, you should be able to post whatever cryptic riddle junk you want to, as long as you're not harassing anybody or threatening anybody. And the Q drops were actually quite clever in that they never really directly threatened anybody. There was never a, hey, go kill this person. You can't do that. And then, Ron Watkins as the former administrator of Q and Jim Watkins as the owner of 8kun would be in a lot of trouble. And they don't do that. They're smart enough to push it to the point where it's good for them, but it doesn't put them in any trouble. Ron Watkins was able to take his links to QAnon, given the fact that he was probably writing the drops for most of Q's existence, or at least dictating what their content was. He was able to turn that into kind of a mainstream media career, where suddenly after the election, nobody wanted Q, but everybody wanted his insights on Dominion voting systems and on election fraud. Now, never mind, he doesn't have any, but he tweeted about them a lot, and people knew who he was because of Q. So he is getting interviewed by national media. He's getting retweeted by Donald Trump. He was able to use that as a springboard to his doomed congressional campaign, which fizzled out a couple weeks ago. So Q was very lucrative for Ron and Jim Watkins. And then when it wasn't useful anymore, the notoriety from Q was lucrative for them.
This is where the Dominion story comes from.
Yeah, the Dominion, sort of blaming Dominion for the election. It didn't really originate with Ron, but he was able to monetize it very quickly. He read the manual for the voting machine system. He tweeted about it constantly. He would tweet out videos of poll workers sort of milling around or holding a thumb drive and going, "Oh, do we know that they're not stealing votes? We have to prove they're not stealing votes. Let's let them know vote stealing is bad." And then, of course, his hundreds of thousands of followers would then immediately start harassing and threatening those people. So Ron was able to use his notoriety from Q as an engine to drive harassment, to drive conspiracy theories, and to really be one of the people who mainstreamed the stolen election movement.
So Jim and his son Ron, Jim and Ron Watkins, these are two people who are featured heavily in an HBO documentary.
Yes.
I think called Searching for Q or Looking for Q, something.
It's Q Into the Storm.
It's Q Into, okay, so Into the Storm. I'm going to ask you about Into the Storm in a moment as well, because it's very similar to the title of your book. But they claim that a lot of this, in the creation of 4chan and then 8chan and 8kun, a big motivation for this is free speech, the ability to post whatever you want, regardless of how controversial that is. Amongst all the conspiracy theories, is that significant and important, do you think, to know about? Is their idea of free speech?
Yeah, the conspiracy theory idea of free speech is a free speech that doesn't really exist. You have the right to post things on Twitter, on 8chan, whatever, but you do not have a right to violate the terms of service of whatever site you're using, and you don't have a right to use that speech to harass, to threaten, to organize people to carry out threats or harassment. You have a right to spread conspiracy theories. You also have a right to be kicked off a platform for spreading conspiracy theories. So this idea of this idealized free speech that people like Ron Watkins have is, I get to say anything I want, anywhere I want to. And that is not a free speech that exists. And I do not want, or, and I don't believe that Twitter or Facebook or whatever is the arbiter of what's true and what's not, but they are the arbiter of what they allow on their site. And if they do not want to allow conspiracy theories and disinformation, then they have every right to kick them off. And that is a kind of free speech that I think is much more beneficial for society. Because when you have a site that allows that kind of unfettered, I say anything I want to, and you can say anything you want to, that almost immediately devolves, certainly into conspiracy theories, but into racism, into anti-Semitism, into violence. And that is not something that most mainstream websites really want on their platform. So that kind of, I can say anything I want free speech is not really desirable for most people.
Is one of the reasons that 8chan went down, hence now we have 8kun, was because that's where manifestos of mass shooter manifestos were being posted?
Yes, there was a string of mass shooter manifestos being posted on another part of 8chan. It wasn't the Q research board, which is where Q was making posts and where the vast majority of Q decoding was going on, but it was on another part of 8chan. And after, I think it was the third one, the company that provided security for 8chan, so provided that denial of service attack safety, antiviral safety, stuff like that, they just said, we don't want to be in business with these people anymore. And they pulled their web hosting security out, and then 8chan immediately was taken down by hackers. And then nobody really wanted them to come over there. The 8chan had to find hosting on some Russian website for a while. They tried it as a peer-to-peer network, which was a total disaster. It was about 4 months where 8chan didn't exist. And then they finally were able to find hosting with this guy in Vancouver, who I talk about in the book a little bit, Nick Lim, who's another one of those, if it's legal, I don't care, kind of free speech absolutists. But it's very prone to bugs. I think it's actually down right now, or it's having a major DDoS attack going on right now, distributed denial of service, which is how 8chan was taken down in the first place. So it's very toxic. People don't really want it. Nobody wants the notoriety that comes with a place like that. So it's a free speech that I think a lot of people just don't want anything to do with anymore.
Coming back to Jim and Ron Watkins, as you mentioned, Ron Watkins ran for Congress in the Republican primary in Arizona. I think he came in 7th or somewhere around there.
He came in whatever last is, that's what he was. I think he got 2.5% of the vote.
At the same time, though, in the same primary, State Representative Mark Fincham won the GOP primary for Arizona Secretary of State. People have pointed out that he has connections to QAnon.
Yeah, so the thing that I'm really most concerned about with QAnon right now, what I've really been trying to talk more about, is the fact that you have Q-pilled candidates in the GOP who are winning primary elections that, if they win their general, would put them in a position to administer elections. So they would be election deniers who have the power to pick, or at least think they have the power to pick who wins an election. I was very fortunate in that a couple months ago, I had the opportunity to testify to Congress about election misinformation and sort of the threat that it presents. And to me, the threat is that a group of these conspiracy theorists, people like Mark Fincham, people like some of these candidates in Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, would win their races and then deputize themselves to decide who wins the 2024 election. These are people who have already said they will not certify a Democratic winner, who believe Donald Trump won the election and that if they had the power, they would decertify Joe Biden's victory. Now, I don't know that such a thing is possible or really has any legal weight. But the more people you get into the levers of the machinery at the state level, the more they have the opportunity to break things and remake things in their own image, to where they could just say, well, okay, the Democrat won, but not to me. There's too many questions. There was fraud. They don't have to prove what it is. They just say, well, we're going to send different electors. And it didn't work in 2020 because there weren't enough people who really wanted to be involved in this. But if you have enough people in 2024 who say, no, the Democrat can't win, it had to be fraud. Only a Republican can win a fair election. And so we're going to send our fake electors and we're not going to certify a Democrat. You've already started to see it. You've seen in a couple of counties, in Otero County in New Mexico, and I think in a couple of counties in Pennsylvania, where Republican primaries are not being certified because more hardcore election denying members of these state election commissions and whatever think that there were conspiracies and fraud and Dominion switched votes and all these things. Doesn't have to be true. They can just gum up the works enough to completely derail the democratic process.
I have read that there's about that in these primaries that are happening across the country, that there's about 80 candidates or so with links to QAnon. About 16 people have actually, with those links, have actually won their primary election. Is this a product of the mainstreaming of QAnon?
It's definitely a product of the mainstreaming. You have a lot of people who are running for office who really have no political background, have no real qualifications, but they've seen that you can be a conspiracy theorist. And if you're running in the right district, if you are running in a district that's going to go Republican no matter what, where your general election really doesn't matter, if you can stand out as the most Trump devoted, most conspiratorial, most anti-Dominion, Joe Biden, cancel culture, whatever candidate, you will stand out enough to possibly win a primary. And a lot of these are low turnout races. This is an off year. People don't vote as much in off years. So if you run a loud, viral candidacy in a state level race where you maybe only need a couple thousand votes to win your primary, and if you win your primary, you're almost certainly going to win your general, it's easier for people to sneak in based around belief in conspiracy theories like QAnon. Because if you throw out a hashtag Q or hashtag where we go, when we go all, you're going to get notoriety from it. The media is going to cover you, and you're going to appeal to a certain type of person who's like, oh, that's my person. They believe the same things I believe. And for most people, it probably won't mean anything. You may not even see it. So there's very little risk in endorsing movements like QAnon, like the stolen election movement. And there's actually quite a bit of risk in saying, no, Trump lost, Biden's the president, I don't like it, but that's the way it is. You can't be a Republican in a lot of districts if that's your stance.
It'll be interesting to see what happens in November with Mark Finchem then for Arizona Secretary of State. Arizona is a purple state, yeah. So in some ways it's hard to imagine then somebody that extreme winning the state. But I don't know. At the same time, I never thought that Donald Trump was going to win in 2016. So I try to always put that caveat in. Are there other places, though, where you have candidates with links to QAnon who very well could win their election?
Yeah, it's a big problem in Nevada. It's a big problem in Michigan. Wisconsin's another one.
So these are considered purple states too.
Yes, these states that weren't supposed to go for Biden. And especially Arizona has turned into this hotbed of election deniers running for office. Part of it is Arizona's kind of always had its quirky politics, but Arizona was the state that when Fox News called it for Biden early on, that kicked off this entire thing of Fox News is in on it. All of this is crooked. The fix is in. It really was Arizona that, because of that early call, became the flashpoint for the stolen election movement. And it's not a surprise to me that there's been so much of this, so many of these lawsuits and fake audits and forensic audits, focusing on places like Maricopa County, because these were places that Trump was supposed to win. And it's unthinkable to some of these people that he didn't win Maricopa County and Michigan and Wisconsin, places that he won in 2016. It's like they don't believe that politics can actually run a certain course, and that certain states can go from Democratic to Republican depending on the popularity of a candidate. And Trump is not a particularly popular candidate. It's not a shock to me that he lost in 2020, that he lost some of these states that he won by very thin margins in 2016. That's just the way politics is. Sometimes you just lose. And these are people who don't believe that Trump can lose, who believe that Trump wins every single thing he sets out to do. And so if he lost, it must have been stolen. And they remake their personalities based around that.
And so there are candidates in these states who potentially could win?
Yeah, they're definitely. I mean, these are states that could go either way, that have gone either way in the past. And you've got, in Arizona, the Republican gubernatorial candidate is very plugged into conspiracy theories. There are, the Michigan Secretary of State race is very similar to that. I think the Michigan governor race might be very similar to that. So there are candidates here who could absolutely put themselves in the position to have power over elections.
So turnout, such a big deal. I think one reason Trump ended up winning in 2016 was because Democrats just weren't as motivated to turn out to the polls. Yeah. Very motivated in 2020, as were Republicans. Yeah. I mean, Donald Trump got a lot of votes in 2020, second most ever, only to Joe Biden.
Right.
But I think that was because of Donald Trump that Joe Biden got so many votes. I almost think to myself that the best thing that could happen, maybe not for the country, but for Joe Biden's chances of re-election would be if Trump were to run again.
Oh, I agree. I think that the farther the Republican Party becomes enmeshed with Trump, I think the less appealing they look to people who are not necessarily Republicans, to people who are maybe casual voters or independents or, Democrats who maybe aren't that into Joe Biden. You either are with Trump or you're against him. And a lot of people are against him. And so as he enmeshes himself more into the party, as there becomes no other choice, I think a lot of people are going, well, I don't necessarily love the Democrats or Biden, but I don't want that. And then a lot of apathetic Democrats will come out and say, well, I hate Trump. I don't really care about Biden, but I hate Trump. So whether or not he runs, I think is still very much an open question. He may not. And I think that if he does run for the Republican primary, he's going to get it. He is the presumptive nominee. There's no one else who can touch him. And I think at that point, you have a Republican Party that's got a really terrible candidate running again. And I think it will go very badly for Republicans.
How about other potential candidates? Someone like Ron DeSantis, who's being talked about heavily about a potential run. Does he have connections to these theories that have originated from QAnon?
Well, DeSantis is a much more traditional Republican, but he's also very plugged into these conspiracy theories. And I think he knows that if Trump doesn't run, I think he's probably the favorite. So he's dialed down really deep into trans panic, into anti-vaccine stuff. I mean, Florida, I think at one point was like mandating that people were not allowed to be vaccinated and hold certain jobs. I mean, just crazy stuff. But that kind of anti-vax, anti-cancel culture, anti-LGBTQ is very big in the Trump Republican Party. And you can't have any success nationally unless you're really plugged into that. Now, never mind that it was Trump who really pushed for the development of the vaccine and did the Operation Warp Speed thing. I mean, if there's any one thing that Trump can take credit for, it is the very, very speedy development of the vaccine. And he's completely turned on it. He got booed when he said that he'd gotten boosted. He said, well, I don't think we should all be taking them. We need to ask more questions. And so DeSantis is outright anti-vaccine, completely anti-vaccine. And it is really jarring to me that you have one of the major political parties in the United States has become completely anti-science to the point where they're refusing vaccination. They've gone against the childhood vaccination schedule. That is not appealing to a lot of people. And there are a lot of people who go, well, I like Republican economics and, maybe I've got some problems with gender identity issues, whatever it is, but I want my kids to get the polio vaccine. And so that is not a type of Republican that is appealing to as many people as it was, I think, in 2016.
Is there money behind pushing QAnon type theories?
There's a huge amount of money to be made by pushing conspiracy theories like QAnon. You have an industry of QAnon books, videos, podcasts, merchandise, QAnon t-shirts, QAnon mugs. And if you extend that out to some of the conspiracy theories that Q has really embraced, there are numerous films about the stolen election that have become hugely popular. Some of this stuff like The Deep Rig and 2000 Mules has made millions of dollars for the people who created these things. The anti-vaccine industry is enormous. I mean, certainly the books and the videos about how terrible it is. If you look back at Plandemic from a couple of years ago, that was hugely viral. Alternative medicine is a gigantic industry, and some of it is totally fine. But some of these people who are pushing quack alternative cures for COVID, things like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, these people have made a huge amount of money off this. They make a ton of money off of the speaking fees that they've been able to get because they've become celebrities in this world. The grift in this world is gigantic, and it keeps you going with believing and pushing some of these things because you're making so much money off it, and it's so intertwined in your own brand.
The name of your book is The Storm is Upon Us. This is an actual saying from QAnon?
Yes, the storm is upon us is the thing that Trump was supposed to tweet when the mass arrests were about to begin. He would tweet, my fellow Americans, the storm is upon us. So for me, that was a much more of a reflection of how conspiracy culture has really taken over mainstream discourse. Now, we're not necessarily more conspiratorial in terms of just the number of people who believe these things, but the reach and the access that conspiracy theories have is something they've never had before. Back in really even the height of the anti-Clinton pro-militia days in the mid-90s, this stuff was still not particularly mainstream. You had to do a little bit of work to find it. You had to know where the weird bookstore was, or when the gun show was coming into town so you could stock up on your new anti-Clinton tapes. You had to know which shortwave station was going to be broadcasting when the UN takeover was coming. Now it's everywhere. And it's a part of our popular culture. It's a part of our mainstream news, mainstream entertainment, mainstream politics. These concepts that really were not acceptable in the mainstream are now very acceptable in certain parts of the mainstream.
Again, your book first came out last week. It's now out in paperback. You've been covering QAnon for a number of years now. Have you become a target of QAnon and QAnon supporters?
I've gotten some trolling, some harassment. Some people, certainly with my last name, and I'm not related to the Rothschild banking family. That's actually what my next book is about, the history of the conspiracy theories about the Rothschild family. But I've definitely gotten weirdos online who say stuff about me that's not true. One of the things that I did when the book was coming out is I made sure that I scrubbed, a lot of the identifying information about me. I don't really talk about my family. But it's not that bad, and it's certainly not anywhere near the harassment and trolling and threats that really any woman or any person of color in any public facing job gets on a daily basis. I know that I'm as much as they come after me sometimes, and especially if I, like after my congressional testimony, there was a lot of crap directed at me, but it's not bad, and it dies down after a couple of days. And being a woman, being a person of color with any kind of job that has a face where you are in the public, especially on social media, is much worse.
Mike Rothschild has been our guest. Again, he is a journalist, and he has joined us for a conversation on his book. It's called The Storm is Upon Us, How QAnon Became a Movement, Cult, and Conspiracy Theory of Everything. Mike Rothschild, I enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it as well.